in the end, to me, and I don't have a legal definition of this word, it's bribery at some level. It's bribing someone with money not to tell the truth. And this cannot be seen as a Christian moral act in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
In other words, it ends up hiding sin with money.
Let me speak some hope into that.
Yes.
And that is this. Yes, you might be the person who's the employee who is, doesn't have much power, doesn't nearly have the money that the employer has, and all of these things. And so you might feel like, man, I just feel like I'm a bug about to get squashed, so I better sign this thing. I want to encourage you to actually reclaim the power that maybe was taken from you.
Nice.
In actuality, maybe begin to understand that maybe they don't have as much power over you than you think. And the one way you can do that is you can say, no. Yeah, you want me to sign this to start working here? No, I'm walking. You want me to sign this so I get a 3-month severance check? No, I'm walking. You can't force me.
Welcome, everybody. We're happy to have you at this Grace Live event. And GRACE, of course, stands for, it's an acronym for Godly Responses to Abuse in Christian Communities. And today we're going to be talking about NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. And there's a lot to talk about. And to talk about these topics, we have invited Boz and Scot McKnight to come and speak and inform us about this, because it's been kind of a controversial topic within Christian communities of late. And so Scot is joining us, and he, of course, is the New Testament professor at Northern Seminary, and he's been that for quite a while. He's also a very prolific writer, and has written a number of really excellent books. And Boz, of course, is the founder of GRACE, and at the moment he is focusing on helping survivors across the United States with civil suits for abuse survivors, civil suits. And anyway, so you can contact him at Boz Law, and that should be, information for that should be up in our chat box at some point. My name is Maureen Garcia, and I work for GRACE. I am their lead safeguarding specialist, and let's get started. So,
Morning. Oh, I guess it's afternoon.
Yes, afternoon here.
Good to be here. I just want to start off by saying one thing. I mentioned this to Scot earlier. If you look at Scott's background, which is a legit background, it's not a fake background.
Yes.
And then you look at mine, which is legit as well. You can tell who the smarter person is in this conversation, and it's not me. I hope he does a lot of talking.
That's good to know. Yes, Scot, your background's great.
Oh, he's on mute too.
Oh, yeah.
I'm in my library in the basement, so this is where my books are, but I have conveniently put a couple of mine facing out for
I see
that's good
for promotion.
That's good. Yeah. So one of the books that he is conveniently facing out is A Church Called Tove, which is a really good book for learning about culture in churches and how to create healthier, safer cultures. So thanks, Scot, for writing that.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm honored to be invited today to be with Boz and with you, Maureen, and the GRACE group, because of all the work that you've done for the church and for Christian witness in the United States, especially, but I'm sure in other places as well, in seeking to bring greater justice in churches and to eliminate or at least minimize abuse in churches. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. And we're really happy to have you here.
Thank you.
So I'm going to get started by asking Boz just some basic definition kind of questions so that we have an idea of, for those of us who don't know much about NDAs, what are we actually talking about? So Boz, can you explain to us, talk a little bit about what exactly is an NDA what kind of forms can we expect to find them in? And what are their legitimate purposes and uses?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hear all the time people ask, well, what, I don't want to sign an NDA or this, NDA that, and very seldom, if ever, will you encounter an agreement that actually is entitled an NDA. And so what you have to do is go, okay, what are we really talking about? And so the NDA is sort of like a generic term that more often the time, at least in my career, I see them under the name of a confidentiality provision. A confidentiality provision that finds its way in employment contracts, severance agreements or employment separation agreements, and oftentimes in settlement agreements in legal cases. I do think you do find some of them, I've never been a part of this, in these church covenant agreements. Like if you want to join a church, you sign this covenant agreement, whatever that means, other than just handing a bunch of control over to a bunch of men. But the reality is sometimes those agreements contain these confidentiality provisions. So we say, well, confidentiality of what? Because that's, as a lawyer, words matter. And we have to go confidentiality of what? Well, in the legal context, when I negotiate a settlement agreement with a client and opposing counsel in the church, one of the provisions that we put in just about every agreement that's part of the confidentiality provision is the confidentiality of the amount of money that was paid in order to settle the case. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that's a good confidentiality provision. I think it's good because my clients don't want that coming out. The church certainly shouldn't be telling people. And so that's a positive confidentiality provision. And that's pretty much about it as to what I would accept as a confidentiality provision in a settlement agreement. But you also have sometimes confidentiality agreements and settlement agreements involving names of parties. So they may say, hey, we want the name of the church or the name of the perpetrator to the parties to agree not to name those people publicly at other, public forums. I generally advise against that type of provision, unless my clients insist, like, I'm fine. I don't want to talk about the name of the church. I want to share my story, but the name of this particular church isn't really central to the story I'm trying to share. So I don't mind that. It's ultimately their call. And then sort of the final, these are in generalities, the final kind of confidentiality provision that I think a lot of people associate with an NDA is where you cannot talk about any of the facts that surround whatever this issue is. So whether it's a settlement agreement, which means I can't even talk about the fact that there is a settlement agreement. I can't talk about the facts leading up to the claim that I'm making. Or if it's a separation agreement from employment, I'm agreeing not to talk about any of the facts related to what led me up to separate my employment with this church or this organization. That's really what I call a gag order. That's saying to somebody, you cannot share your story, whatever it was, whether it was being sexually abused at a church, whether it was being spiritually abused by church leaders. When you sign that agreement, you're signing away your ability to share that story. And it's in essence what I tell opposing counsels when I say we're not going to agree to this is I said, this settlement and the money your client is paying is not hush money. It's not to keep them quiet. It's money that they're paying so that my client A can do whatever they want with it, but they more often than not are going to utilize that money as part of their healing from the abuse that they suffered from within your particular environment. So that's in general. So it's NDA, sort of a layperson term. It's much more what we call a confidentiality provision. Confidentiality of what? And then you got to look at, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, in what context is this? Do I sign this in order to have to get a job here? Do I sign this in order to get a separation agreement and a severance money? Or do I sign this as part of a settlement agreement? Last thing I'll say real quick about NDAs is oftentimes within this context of these types of agreements, you have what we call non-disparagement provisions. Oftentimes, non-disparagement provisions are linked to these confidentiality provisions. And a non-disparagement provision is basically says that the party or parties, usually it's just pointing one way, and that's to the employee, the parties or the party cannot disparage the church or anybody in leadership at the church. And so that begs the question, what some of you are asking is, what does that mean? Disparage. And that's another way I found, that's another way of, it's a roundabout way of enforcing a confidentiality, because NDAs today, ever since Harvey Weinstein, which is a good thing, have a bad name. When you mention NDA, the state of California has outlawed NDAs in settlement agreements on cases that have been filed. So it's a bad, so how do we get around that? Well, we're not going to call it an NDA. We're not even going to call it a confidentiality provision. We're going to call it a non-disparagement provision, which, if you think about it, ultimately has the same impact as a confidentiality provision. And we can talk about that a little bit more later, but I routinely counsel my clients against signing anything that contains a non-disparagement provision, because it is a subjective term, it's not defined, and it's usually these types of provisions don't have an end life. They go on and on and on. So you have to spend the rest of your life wondering if what I just said to somebody, even in passing, violates my non-disparagement provision, of which I got a little bit of money 10 years ago, but now they can come after me for violating that agreement. So that's a 1,000-foot view of this whole issue of what is an NDA.
Yeah, thank you for that. You made some great distinctions within that that are really helpful about what types of, how these things kind of pop up, but also about the difference between like finances that are given to help somebody to recover from whatever they've experienced, and finances that are given as, what did you say, like hush money kind of thing.
Yeah.
Those are two very different things. So Scott, you've written in a number of places, of course, in your book that I recommended a little while ago, and also last March, I think possibly March 2nd, you had written a bit about NDAs, and basically you were writing in response to a ruling from the National Labor Relations Board that said that companies are no longer able to, here's a quote from your piece, offer severance agreements that prevent employees from making disparaging remarks about their former employers. And you noted that technically religious organizations are not, they're exempt from a number of the National Labor Relations Act. But even so, you argue that Christian communities shouldn't use that. So can you talk about why?
Yeah. Well, I think Boz is going to be better at describing this actual act that was proposed by the National Labor Relations Board. But I was told by someone who's involved in this situation that churches and Christian institutions probably have an exemption from this. And I was asked what I thought about it, and I said, well, it is really a peculiar thing when, let's say, the Starbucks, I think this was a case about Starbucks or something, that when it's in a public sector, a business, and they have made a policy, a law, whatever it's called, that they can't do that there, but the church can still do this and hide the truth. I found that to be slippery for the church to say, okay, well, we don't have to agree with this. And that's in fact the case of why it was first brought to my attention. But when I first started these stories about NDAs, the first time I heard it, I did not even know what an NDA was. I asked someone and they said, well, that's when you work at a place and you produce, let's say, a program for them, and then you change jobs, you can't take the program with you. And they said, well, that's a non-disclosure agreement about proprietary information. I thought, okay, well, I guess that's legitimate. I said, I don't think that's what's going on here. Okay. It was about disparagement. And it was actually, I think, worse than that. So over the last 5 years, particularly since the Willow Creek story broke, I've been thinking about this. And after my daughter and I, Laura Behringer and I, wrote this book, A Church Called Tove, this is no kidding, for the first 16 months after that book appeared, we were hearing 3 to 5 stories a week from churches about power abuse. And a lot of these stories had NDAs connected to them where you couldn't talk. So I've had to think about this. And as a Christian professor at a seminary, trying to teach pastors the right things to do when I get my opportunity, these are some of the things that I've said over time that have come to my attention. I think some of these they're approaching this issue from different angles, but in the end, it's all about transparency and truth telling. So this is the big issue to me. When non-disparagement agreements come up, they are agreements between someone with power and money, with someone with less power and probably less money, or I'm dealing right now with a woman with quite a bit less money who needs the money but has decided not to press the case, is that it's getting someone not to tell the truth in order to protect the reputation of a pastor or a church or some institution.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, the big issue is the asymmetry of power and the capacity of someone, the power of someone to coerce, persuade, or even cajole someone into making an agreement that will prevent them from being able to tell the truth. In the end, to me, and I don't have a legal definition of this word, it's bribery at some level. It's bribing someone with money not to tell the truth. And this cannot be seen as a Christian moral act in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
In other words, it ends up hiding sin with money, because in most of these cases, someone doesn't want, let's say, someone with power. In many cases, it's been pastors, leaders in churches, doesn't want their reputation soiled or stained by something that they have done or said, could be almost criminal. They don't want this to be known because it could hurt their reputation. And they're more concerned about their reputation than living in the light and telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I also find that it's not only hiding sin with money. I've mentioned this, but there's an asymmetry of power at work that becomes a power abuse case.
Mm-hmm.
Is that I have what you need, money, because you won't have a job for 6 months. It's going to be difficult. So therefore, I'm going to make you go silent. This is just wrong for Christians to do this. And so it ends up becoming, for me, another way of looking is it's an economic exploitation of someone,
Yes.
of the marginal, of the less advantaged. And not always, not every NDA involves someone who doesn't have any money,
Mm-hmm.
but they will lose their status, and that is connected to what they're doing. The other thing is, and Boz brought this up, and it's so important. I've seen probably a half a dozen NDAs in my life,
Mm-hmm.
and not one of them said that this is an NDA or a non-disclosure agreement. And the last one I read was very, very slippery. It was so well written. It was just, this is what we agree that we would want you to agree with us. And the next thing you know is that we would assume that you would not be willing to say something about this. And I thought, whoa, that was very smooth. And I don't know who wrote that sort of thing, but it was very well done. I would like to have had that kind of smoothness at times when I've been put in difficult positions. But there's a level of deceit in this sort of language,
yeah,
that I think we need to confront and expose. Sometimes these cases arise, and I'm sure Boz has got 50 stories of this, is pressure is put on a person.
Yeah.
I know of people who've been given 24 hours to sign an NDA. Now, I didn't call it an NDA, but it's what it is. Some people are given a week. Well, this is a very difficult situation for someone who's losing their job.
Yeah.
They have to consider, do we have sufficient money with the agreement and the severance package that they're going to give us to be able to survive for the next 3 months where I might need, and all that pressure is put on them. And I think that this is unchristian, and it's profoundly unpastoral. And the last thing that I would say when it comes to the reflections that I've had on this, other than protecting the reputation of some man almost always in some church, is that this type of behavior hurts Jesus. It hurts the gospel. It hurts Christian witness profoundly. It hurts the church. It hurts everybody. It ultimately hurts our nation. Is when it is, then eventually, the truth is going to come out. And when it comes out, people realize that that pastor, that church, that human resources department at that Christian institution was paying people off not to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. That right there is the worst thing the church can be doing for itself, especially in our situation today. When it covers up sexual abuse, sexual harassment, worse things than that, when it covers up money abuse, when it covers up power abuse at a really significant patterned level, spiritual abuse, I think that we are really harming the gospel and our Lord. So those are some of the things that, now Boz and I have actually talked about this a few times, so most of that probably came from him.
No, that's not true. I want to maybe help clarify a few things as well, because I think it's important. And I've just seen some of the comments online. Number one thing I did miss earlier, when you have a confidentiality provision, sometimes you do have confidentiality provisions, oftentimes, quite frankly, when you're working at a place that deals with trade secrets. So if you work at a business and you learn some of their strategies or whatever we call trade secrets, and that's a whole nother program for another day, that will probably put most everybody, including me, asleep. But a trade secret, that is, to me, legitimate grounds for a confidentiality provision. I don't, quite frankly, you'd have to really convince me that you have a trade secret issue within a church environment. Okay. I don't know that. I'm sure there becomes some argument, but that quite frankly just doesn't exist in a church environment. Mm-hmm. Number two, somebody's asked about NDAs in investigations. If you're asked to participate in a third-party investigation, but as part of that, you're supposed to sign off, that you're not going to talk about it. Well, unless that investigation is being directed by law enforcement, then there is absolutely no authority for the one conducting the investigation to require you to sign an NDA. Because here's why. This is really, really important. I don't want to get too legal, but it is important. An NDA, or a confidentiality provision, is usually part of a contract. A contract, to be a valid contract, requires consideration on both sides. That means if I'm leaving a church and they want me to sign an NDA, I'm just going to use the term NDA because it's what we're using, but they want me to sign an NDA. I can say I don't want to sign it, but we can also come up to a contract where they are going to agree to pay me 6 months severance, something they don't have to do. If I'm an at-will employee, I get fired tomorrow, and unless it's based on some type of unlawful discrimination, the employer owes me nothing as an at-will employer. But they might say, well, you know what? We are going to agree. We're going to do something we don't otherwise have to do, which is consideration. We're going to pay you X amount of dollars, and then you're going to do something that you don't otherwise have to do, and that is you're going to sign off on this agreement that includes, usually it's a release of liability, but within that release, there's also oftentimes a confidentiality provision. Mm-hmm. That's a contract. But if you go, so each side you have to have consideration. When I do settlement agreements for my clients, it's a contract. It's a settlement agreement which says you're going to pay X amount of dollars, and in exchange for that, my client's going to dismiss their lawsuit against you and sign a general release. That's the agreement. If somebody violates that, it's a breach of contract. Right. Now, here's the dangerous part of some of these confidentiality provisions. The more evil ones include even what's called a liquidated damages provision, which means this. It says, listen, if you violate this confidentiality provision, we can't, and it's a violation, which means it's a breach of the contract, and you would otherwise have to show that we would have to prove that you breached the contract and that breach caused certain damages to us. Well, because that's going to be sort of hard to figure out, we're all going to agree ahead of time on this liquidated damages provision, which means that if we can establish that you've breached this provision, the confidentiality provision, we automatically get this liquidated damages, whatever that is, $10,000 per violation, $5,000 per violation. That's really bad stuff. If you see the word liquidated damages, run, because what that means is now all they have to show is that you violated that agreement. And now they don't have to go to court to prove how much damages you caused them. You've already agreed ahead of time on how much you're going to pay them per quote unquote violation. So to go back to help people understand, it's a contract. And so when you're sitting down to do an investigative interview and you're there voluntarily and they say, we want to take your statement, but you got to sign this confidentiality provision that you're not going to talk about anything. You can get up and walk out. Okay. And even if you sign that, I would argue as your lawyer, you can still get up afterwards and go tell the whole world what you want, because there's no, where was the consideration on their part? What did they give you that they otherwise didn't have to give you? And sitting down to talk to you in a part of the investigation is not consideration. So I think those are really important things, because when we go to work, if you get a contract when you go to work, some of these churches, you start a church, they give you a pack of paper. And I can tell you, because I've had employees who do this. You start a job, they give you all this stuff, you do the first day, review this, sign it, get it back to us. You're so excited to be at this job. You're looking at stuff, you're not even reading it, you're just signing it, okay? There's a good likelihood you might be signing a confidentiality provision that says, listen, the consideration for this is that we're gonna hire you. So we're going to hire you. We don't have to, hiring you is not something we have to do, but we are choosing to hire you. In exchange for hiring you, you're going to sign this paperwork. And one of the documents happens to be an NDA or a confidentiality provision. So practical advice, read stuff before you sign it, especially if it's at that beginning part of employment where everything looks wonderful and everybody's happy and you're just signing stuff and you're so glad to have a job. No, take time to read it. And you might have to make a hard decision if you come across one of these agreements that they're asking you to sign. You might have to come to a part where you go, wow, I thought I was going to take this job, but now I'm not, because I'm not going to sign off on this. But then on the other end, let me just finish real quick. On the other end of it is when you're leaving employment and they want to give you money, just like Scott was talking about. I have talked to people who are suddenly told you're gone. And I've talked to people, Scott, who have said, we want you to decide in 15 minutes whether you sign this agreement or not. And the agreement says we'll give you sometimes 3 months severance. Okay. But in exchange for that, you have to sign all these things, including a non-disparagement clause, a confidentiality clause. And these poor people are in a position going, what do? I really need this money, but I already know this is not a good idea. And so many of them feel forced in signing this. And the problem is they may get 3 months of severance, but that NDA or that non-disparagement provision doesn't have an end life.
Yeah.
So you're getting this amount of money to promise something back to them this much.
Yeah.
And so it's really, so that's on the other end. And I've talked to more and more, just counseled more and more people. If you don't want to sign something that has a non-disclosure or confidentiality provision or non-disparagement, try to negotiate that out. And if they won't take it out, walk. And I know it's easy. People say, yeah, but I need the money. I know you need the money, but you know what? 6 months, a year from now, you would have spent that money and you're still going to be held to this ridiculous contract that you signed. And it's really tough when you sign a contract. It's really tough to have a court throw that out because you were under some type of coercion or pressure. We can talk about that, but legally, that's the rare exception that a court will allow. And so you got to think about those things at the time. And it's different when you have a lawsuit and you sign a settlement agreement. You already have a lawyer who's hopefully advising you correctly. But when you're leaving an employment and they say, we're going to give you this money if you sign this agreement, so many times people they haven't even talked to a lawyer. And so at the very least, you look at them and say, I will consider signing this, but I have to speak with a lawyer first and have a lawyer review this before I make a decision. And if they say no, walk out. They should say yes, because they could get in some legal trouble depending on what they have you signing. They could get into some legal trouble if they didn't give you that time to seek counsel from a lawyer before making that decision. Anyway, I threw a lot out there, but there's so much to this. And I just think that people understand. I just think people think that these NDAs have a lot more power than they do, especially when they're not in the context of a signed contract with adequate consideration.
So what I'm hearing from both of you is that this is not obviously just a legal thing. This is ethical, moral. This has to do with you know, how we walk as Christians, as followers of God. And some of what I'm hearing you say, one of the things we teach at Grace is that, you know, abuse, it always involves a discrepancy of power. Like you have
Mhm.
an asymmetry of power, right? So what you're both telling me is that in many of these cases, that these are actually tactics that people are using within church communities or organizations, tactics that parallel what abusers do, that they give you a little bit and require a lot, that they are requiring silence forever, you know, through whatever different tactics, like an abuser may use threats or shame or having the victim think that they were complicit in their own abuse, and all those things work to silence. But from what you're telling me, NDAs, you know, or NDAs in certain circumstances are being used the same way. They're being used coercively, and then they're being used to silence. And basically what is happening is that then the victims of this, the ones who are coerced and the ones who are signing these, are forced into not being able to tell the truth about their experiences. And Scott, I know that you've written about this. And for you, there's an element in which this interrupts the ability to tell the truth. And if it interrupts the ability to tell the truth, how do you then pursue justice?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, this is a good segue to a question that Boz provoked for me in what he just said is some of and you brought up this covenant agreements or whatever they're called with some churches. Just imagine that you are yearning for an opportunity to serve the Lord at what you think is one of the greatest churches you've ever seen in your life. You just can't wait for the opportunity. You're getting interviewed, and you know, you go through the interview process and you get the opportunity at the Pure Church, the best church in the world. And they ask you to sign something that would say that you will not go to Twitter or social media about something that's happening in the church. And your perspective, besides the fact that you're right now standing on the threshold of status enhancement in your own mind, that you're going to get to be on the ministry team of an ideal church. And you are longing for this, and you just can't imagine that this church would do anything that bad. And you think, well, of course I wouldn't say anything negative about this church. It's so good. Then you get inside, and 3 years later, you realize that the pastor is hitting on women in the church, or that the pastor is firing people that don't deserve to be fired, or everybody who disagrees with this pastor gets demoted and they get assigned jobs that they don't want to do, so they become miserable and leave. And now all of a sudden, you're because of your fires of justice, you want to be able to bring justice to your church. Mm-hmm. And you go in and talk to the right person and they tell you to shut up, or they tell you, okay, thank you, and nothing happens. Somehow they silence you, or they at least silence your concerns. And then you want to talk about it, and then they bring up this non-disparagement that you signed. And you realize that you are virtually covering up wrong behaviors, sinful behaviors, at times immoral behaviors, because you signed that. And I'm finding, I was stunned, Boz. I was stunned, Maureen, when I learned that there are many churches today who are requiring virtual NDAs to get employed at that church. This is a way of covering their butts. Instead of doing it when they leave, they do it right up front, and they hold it over your head the entire time. Mm. And this prevents people in churches telling the truth, speaking prophetically when they need to speak prophetically, and pursuing justice. And that's why in Church of Tove, we talk about telling the truth and not just spinning false narratives. but this sort of thing also prevents justice from being done in churches. And I just can't see that can ever be the truth. And I think that we need to stand out from the business world with a step higher or two, where we stand for the truth. I have almost never seen a situation where if the pastor had simply told the truth right up front, that the situation couldn't have been resolved. Most churches adore their pastors so much that if they confess their sins, they will stand up and give them a standing ovation for honesty and admiration. And if pastors would do that in most of these situations, the pastor will be forgiven and can go through a process. What amazes me, this is another point, those who preach the gospel of sins that can be forgiven by the grace of God at the cross of Christ through the power of the Spirit. I'm a Trinitarian thinker, okay? That those who preach that message often have the hardest time admitting their own sins. That is really a sad commentary of ministers of the gospel who simply will not admit that they did something wrong. So that's a little sermon.
Thank you for that.
Keep preaching.
So the difficulty, because my understanding, and Boz, correct me if I'm wrong, is that if you're being asked to sign a non-disparagement agreement, but they're asking you to not talk about something criminal, that can be a loophole where they can actually talk about the thing, even though they've signed an agreement. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can't enforce a unlawful contract, and that would be an unlawful contract. But let me go back to what you said earlier and what Scott was just talking about, this whole notion of the imbalance of power, and that these agreements really illustrate that in a very profound way. But let me speak some hope into that.
Yes.
And that is this. You might be the person who's the employee who is doesn't have much power, doesn't nearly have the money that the employer has, and all of these things. And so you might feel like, man, I just feel like I'm a bug about to get squashed, so I better sign this thing. I want to encourage you to actually reclaim the power that maybe was taken from you. Nice. In actuality, maybe begin to understand that maybe they don't have as much power over you than you think. And the one way you can do that is you can say, no. Yeah, you want me to sign this to start working here? No, I'm walking. You want me to sign this so I get a 3-month severance check? No, I'm walking. You can't force me. You want me to sign this in order to settle this case? No, let's go to trial. You want me to sign this or I'm going to get church discipline? I mean, and again, I want to be careful with this, but church discipline, big whoop. Like, what are they going to do? Like, people, you understand, church is not a prison. You can walk out. They cannot force you to stay. It means you can walk away. If you get church disciplined because you didn't sign this, so be it. Who cares? It means a group of people who are all stuck in their bubble all think that you're a bad person. Well, you know what? You don't want to be in that bubble anyway. You don't really care what these people think. And so I think we have to start helping people understand that maybe you're not as powerless as you think, that it's time to reclaim some of that power and the power that you think was taken away. Because I think what you're going to find is maybe it wasn't so much power taken away from you. It's just the realization that you actually have more power than you think in that situation. And the power is that you can decide to walk away and not give them what they are demanding. And that they can scream at you, they can threaten you, they can kick you out of their community. So be it. That the power that and the angrier they get when you don't do what they want you to do, that means you're actually balancing more and more of that power, because they can't handle the fact that you are exercising your power and authority over yourself. So, again, yes, it is. It's the whole picture is an imbalance of power, but I think on the hopeful end, and this is what I try to encourage folks who come to see me is think about this. Think about what you can do in this situation where a year from now, you will look back and actually go, I am so glad I made the hard decision there.
Mhm.
Versus some of the people that I've talked to and they did the best they could at the moment in time, but they're going, man, it's been 3 years. I got this measly amount of money that we spent in 2 months. And I still feel like if I say anything about this particular employer, I could get sued. So I got to just keep quiet and I can't handle this. And I feel like they still are wielding power over me. I'm going to go through life with this organization wielding power. And they said, if I'd only known that at the time I should have walked away, they would have lost all their control and power over me. I think we need to be talking about that more, and we need to be encouraging and people to do that. And I think sometimes within the church, people are really uneasy about that because we're so ingrained, especially those of us who grew up in a church, that there are those in church with power, and we're not one of those people. And so when those in church in power start demanding things of us, whether it's the session, whether they bring in peacemakers and we sit through some Christian conciliation thing and they want us to sign something, I mean, all that stuff, we can say no. Mm-hmm. And you're going to get called names. You might be called a non-Christian. The older I get, the less I'm concerned with what people think of me. And I don't mean that if I'm hurting somebody, obviously, but I grew up in the Christian world where I felt it was so important what other people are thinking about me. And the more I've let that go, I think the more empowering that is. And I want to encourage others to do that as well, especially in this context.
Mm-hmm. Boz, what would you say to somebody that has already signed an NDA?
Well, first of all, again, I'd say, well, what did you sign? Because I've had people say, I signed an NDA. And I say, well, let me look at it. And I look at it and go, actually, this doesn't say what you think it means. This actually says you have to hold the agreement that you signed confidential. But it doesn't say anything about you not talking about what led up to it. So, and then they're relieved. Mm-hmm. Then there are the more comprehensive agreements that are those things that keep you quiet. And those are tough calls because like I said, it's very difficult to get an agreement like that set aside by court. Right. And so then I'll try to look at it and go, well, at the end of the day, let me just say this. If you have already signed a confidentiality agreement that keeps you quiet from talking about something, but you really feel inclined that you have to talk about it for whatever reason, you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision that either you're going to remain quiet and abide by the terms of the agreement, or you're going to decide that speaking is more important than the terms of this agreement, and that speaking will carry certain risks. But keep in mind this as well. For a church or an organization to come after you for violating a confidentiality provision, that costs them money. So to them, it has to be really worth it for them to go after you. So you might get they may do nothing. You might get a really nasty letter from a lawyer saying, if you don't retract this, you're going to get sued. And sometimes that's all they intend to do. They pay the lawyer $500 to write a nasty letter, because a lot of people get a nasty letter from a lawyer. What do? They comply with it. And then there's a smaller percentage that will actually move forward and might file suit against you. You just have to know and understand that risk. But sometimes people have to make the decision that risk is worth it, because it's so important for them to speak about whatever they had previously said or were coerced into agreeing not to speak about.
Mm-hmm.
If I can step in here.
Of course.
Okay. In the last, to say 2 years, Chris and I, Laura and I have dealt with people who have decided to say no. Yeah. Every one of those people are happy with their decision. And sometimes it cost them a lot of money. Mm-hmm. But the freedom of being able to talk, in some cases, has led to many people being able to have that freedom to talk, and has brought a greater sense of justice in that church, or at least it has exposed the hideousness of some of the NDAs that the church imposed on some of their former employees. So when Boz encourages people to use your agency and say no, I'm giving a great big Aramaic word, amen, to that one.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things we teach when we do our trainings is that a safer church, one that prevents and responds well to abuse, will create a culture from the leaders on down throughout the entire community of empowerment, that people are free to speak their truth, their experience, what they've seen concerning behaviors, abusive behaviors. And so to prevent people from doing that within a Christian community is to work against creating a place that's safe from abuse. And one other thing I wanted to mention from what I'm hearing you guys talk about is the idea, like a lot of people will be like, well, what kind of things are churches not wanting you to talk about? Because if it's a criminal thing, then, it can be reported. But what a lot of people don't understand is that there's a lot of abuse that can take place, especially when you have a situation like a church where you have people in power and other people not. And the abuses that are taking place are not necessarily criminal or illegal in whatever state you're in. So there's lots of emotional abuse, psychological abuse, different types of more subtle kind of harassment, financial abuse. So there's lots of different types of abuses that can happen that aren't criminal. So you can be being asked to not talk about ever abuse that you've either witnessed or experienced, and that is for people who are survivors of abuse outside of that, they will talk about how the burden of keeping the secret of the abuse is very damaging and harmful.
Yeah.
So creating a culture where people are free to speak openly reduces the stigma and the shame and the feelings of foolishness when you've been a victim of abuse. And it models, like Scott's saying, the more people do this, the more people say no and talk about it, the more people will feel free to say no and talk about it. And then the safer the culture becomes, which is great.
Yeah.
Now it's about 12 to 3. So let's transition a bit because we've had a lot of engagement. Thank you so much to our viewers for engaging with us. So we're going to switch to start answering questions. When you ask questions, for those of you that are asking questions, don't provide any personal information within the questions, make them as general as possible. And we're only going to have time for a few questions, although we've all agreed we're going to go over for maybe 10 minutes or so. But if we don't get to your question, you can feel free to go to the Grace website, and there's a form where you can contact us. And so send your question that way as well, and we'll see, we'll get back to you with some kind of an answer for you. Okay, so let's see what questions we have popping up. Second. Okay, so is there a precedent for NDAs being deemed null or void because the time frame or the scope of the NDA far outweighed what was actually necessitated? Just like when corporate non-compete agreements extend for beyond what is reasonable without putting burden on the departing employee.
So I'm going to give a lawyer answer, which will really thrill everybody. It just depends on what the NDA or the agreement says. I mean, there's not this standard uniform NDA out there. You have to look at the language of the agreement. So, when somebody came to me about a year ago who had signed a separation agreement that included a non-disparagement clause related to a very well-known Christian organization. So they were like, it was so broad. It was like they got this little bit of money and this non-disparagement that lasts forever. And so I started researching that particular state. And what I discovered was that there was very little law on the issue. And the few things that I found were not in my client's favor. And so, yes, whoever wrote that question, you're exactly right on non-compete agreements. That's a whole nother topic, but because non-compete agreements is a statutory creation, which means that the state, like Florida, has a statute that says certain non-compete agreements are lawful if they do A, B, and C, but they can't do D, E, and F. So sometimes a non-compete agreement can be too broad. You can't work anywhere in the United States. No, you can't do that. But we really don't have this, at least in the states that I'm aware of, including Florida, we don't have that something similar with regard to non-disparagement. And so I will say that this National Labor Relations Act, without getting too complicated on that, there was this there was this ruling that came out, and then the general counsel of the NLRA wrote a letter that helped explain the ruling and what the current state of the law is. And I tweeted about this back, and in fact, I pulled it up for my own notes on March 25th. But what it in essence said was that these non-disparagement agreements and these confidentiality agreements are generally not going to be enforced unless they're very narrow. Like a non-disparagement, what I tell people is, listen, my client's not going to agree to non-disparagement, but if my client goes out and lies about you, you always have the option to bring a lawsuit against them for defamation, regardless of what this agreement says. And that's what this lawyer letter from the NLRA says. It says non-disparagements aren't going to be adhered to unless it's non-defamatory clause, obviously. But the interesting thing about this letter is she says that these rulings are both prospective and retroactive, which means if you signed a confidentiality agreement or a non-disparagement agreement as part of as an employee, not as a part of a settlement in a lawsuit, because I don't think this applies to that, but as far as in context of employment, there is a likelihood that based on this decision and based on this general counsel letter, that even if you signed it 5 years ago, it's not enforceable. The only caveat to this is they have an exception for religious organizations. Now you might go, oh, forget it, that's what we're talking about. Well, true, except they do say, when they define, because as a lawyer, I go, what's a religious organization? Well, if it's a religious organization like a church or a mission organization, yes. But if it's a religious organization, let's just say, and I'm just making something up because I haven't studied this, but let's say Hobby Lobby. We all know that Hobby Lobby is owned by a Christian family, okay? But Hobby Lobby is not in the business of carrying out religious work. They're in the business of selling crafts, okay? Right. Well, Hobby Lobby, my understanding here is Hobby Lobby would not fall under that religious exemption, because they might be a religious organization, but they're not carrying out religious, carrying out duties in nature of what we call religious character, and therefore may not be. So just because don't give up too quickly. If you go, well, I signed this. If it was with a church or a mission agency, a Christian school, probably. But if it was with a company that happens to be owned by Christians and might have a Christian environment, whatever that is, this letter and this ruling actually may be what you need to set aside that agreement.
So just a reminder for those of you who are watching and listening, if you want to reach out to Boz, there should be contact information for him within our chat box. So thank you for that. So here's another one. If a standard were to be adopted for use, non-use of NDAs and non-disparagement agreements in Christian organizations, what would it need to include?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Okay. So if a standard were to be adopted for NDAs in Christian organizations, what would it need to include?
How about not having one?
I like that answer.
I'm for you.
I'm for you. Yes.
Yeah. Scott, you were talking about a group that you and I both have been talking with, that have been trying to work on almost creating a standard that says if you want to be a part of this organization of a collective of ministries, you have to sign off that you don't have these types of
right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great standard. Okay.
I mean, I'm amening this with Boz. Yeah, let's get rid of them. But I think that even at that level, I think we can expect higher levels for Christians of saying that we are going to tell the truth.
Yes.
And we are not going to silence our employees, and we're going to make it a safe place for our employees to bring their concerns to their directors, to their bosses, and they will not experience retaliation, but we will work together at discussing these things and coming to a better agreement about what's going on. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you're talking about, a culture that's safe and truth-telling. This is where you're dealing with narcissistic people who want to be in charge, and they're afraid that anybody who gets any credit is going to discredit them.
Yes.
And how, I've asked this question myself 5,000 times in the last 5 years. Why do Christian churches, why do Christian institutions find themselves hiring such corrupted, narcissistic male individuals at the top of their business or church so often? Why do we have so much of this? Something is corrupted at the very core of the sort of job descriptions and the kinds of things that we look at when we hire people.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. That's true. And you're not the only one who's been asking those questions.
yeah.
Caitlin Beatty has written a book on, celebrity
Yeah.
culture.
Very good book. Very good book.
Yeah, she's amazing. And then Chuck DeGrout had written about narcissisms in the church as well. But you're right, there's what's going on with us, that this is not just acceptable, but desired,
I just want to reiterate, like maybe a broken record, if people even remember what records are, but just remember, like, you don't have to sign this. You're not being threatened by a prosecutor. You're not being threatened by, you don't have to engage with these agreements, and you don't have to engage with these communities if they insist on it. I can tell you the healthiest decision for you, as difficult as it may be, is to walk out of that community, and you will be liberated. I cannot tell you how many people that I've been able to walk alongside during similar types of seasons of life who will contact me 6 months later and go, I was going through such a hard time there because I wasn't sure if we should do this and whether we should leave. And you know what? Best decision I ever made. Some of them, like, they're working at Home Depot instead of being a pastor at a church. And they said, this was some of the best seasons of my life. Why didn't I start working at Home Depot earlier? But it's just this notion of they finally, when they realized that they could they had agency to walk away. It was very liberating. Difficult, not easy.
Yes.
You lose community, because we spend so much as Christians, and I don't think necessarily this is another topic for another day too, is, when you get involved with church, that's your community. In fact, years ago when we were heavily involved in the church, I asked my wife one day, how many non-Christians do we even know? But when that's become such part of your community, to be out of that, whether you're kicked out or whether you make the difficult decision intentionally to walk out, is painful at first. But Scott, I agree with you. I say this, my experience has been the same thing, that the people who have walked, as painful as it was at the time, the ones who circle back with me, they're all so much happier and healthier months later when they're out of that environment and realize that they did have agency and they utilized their agency. And now they're utilizing their agency in other aspects of their life, which is really new to them, especially so many who grew up in evangelicalism.
Yes. Yeah. And agency is so important. That's another thing that we teach when we are instructing churches how to create safer cultures. That agency is very important to victims, survivors, but to everyone in general, to know that they have agency to make choices. Yeah. So we have a comment here that kind of fits in with what you were both just saying now. And it also fits in with another thing that we teach at Grace, is that the responsibility to create a safe culture is everyone in the community's responsibility, not just the leaders, not just the youth ministers or the people who work in the children's nursery. It's everyone's responsibility. And so the comment we have here is, wouldn't it be wonderful if our communities would come around those that are refusing to sign NDAs and would stand with them in solidarity and provide monetary support if needed, instead of disparaging them, questioning them, attacking them, standing with the institutions that are demanding silence. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we did that, instead of people automatically wanting to protect their leaders or their institutional reputations? And ultimately, it sounds like that's what our desire and our goals are. That is exactly, what a great comment. That's exactly what we want. We want people to be able to stand.
And I think there are those people in communities. I think that's what's so much where social media, for all its ills, has done some really good things in providing people who feel like they're so isolated, whether they're victims of abuse or victims of something like this, to be able to connect with other people and go, okay, there are people out here that understand and empathize and demonstrate compassion. Sadly, it's not the people that were in my church doing life together with me, but it's this group of people. And so that's, to me, that shows that there's hope, and
Yes.
and we move towards that hope.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, the recent story that came out of Taylor University with the professor who was
Yes.
sacked because, I mean, this is what I saw. I don't know if this is totally true, but because she had Jamar Tisby in her syllabus, the number of people who have risen to the occasion and supported this woman professor is very encouraging. But I also think that at the institution there could have been other professors and other staff, administration, who could have stood up in these situations. We don't know the whole story, of course, but sometimes there's capacity for the local institution to do things, people in the local institution to do things that can put some of the brakes on these dismissals like this and help with the finances. But I think we do need to create safer environments in our communities so that these sorts of things are seen as serious violations of our cultural norms and mores, that we don't do this sort of thing at our church or our institution. So good. I'm not saying we don't. I'm saying we want an environment like that.
Right. So Boz and Scott, do you guys have any last thoughts to leave us with?
Scott,
Both of you. You
Okay.
go ahead, Scott.
You know, my daughter and I, because of what happened with the church called Tove.
Yeah.
By the way, I've done 178 podcasts on the church called Tove. So podcast is taken over our life at times. But because we were asked so many times what to do about it, we have written another book that'll come out in September called Pivot.
Awesome.
It's about the practices and principles that are involved in transforming church cultures toward Tove cultures. And I really believe that we need twofold work. We need to expose the problems in these situations, fight against covenant agreements that are going to block people from telling the truth once they discover it, fight against churches signing and creating NDAs in order to pay people off to silence criticisms of leaders and the reputation of the church. But we also need to work on the other end of this at transforming our church culture so that they're safe. And an excellent organizational scholar at MIT named Edgar Schein says it takes 7 years to transform a culture of a business when the people in the organization want to do it.
Right.
And so this is a long haul. This is a decision to work very hard at institutionalizing and embodying a safe Tove culture. And I think many of us are committed to trying to work on these sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I meet people like this all the time in my work. There are so many good Christians, good pastors, good leaders that really desire to create safer cultures and are really willing to do
Good.
the work.
That's good to hear.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Boz, how about you?
I would just say that if you've got questions, don't try to necessarily answer them yourself. If you've got questions, whether it's with regard to an agreement you've been asked to sign, whether it's you're just starting at an employment that you think this might be the best job ever, but they've given you this document that you're a little uneasy with, or you're leaving employment and they've given you this and told you that you have to sign this in a certain period of time, or you feel like you might even have a claim against the church for whatever. Talk to a lawyer. Yes, of course you can contact me, but contact somebody who knows the law and who can sit down with you, especially as it relates to these types of faith-based cultures, and sit down and talk with them. And because you want to be, one way you are empowered is through information. And so if you might decide you do sign this, but at least you're making an informed decision.
Absolutely.
Where you're not looking back going, man, if I'd only known then what I know now. So don't hesitate, reach out. You can reach out to us here at Boz Law. Happy to at least help you, try to set through and look through a lot of the complicated words and, languages that legal languages that tend to intimidate people. So we just go ahead and sign it because no, our job is to help you understand that and so that you are empowered to make decisions that are best for you and your family, and not necessarily what might be best for church leaders.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We're going to be wrapping up now. So for our viewers, I just want to remind you that if you have questions that weren't answered, go to the Grace website and fill in the contact form and let us know what your questions were. Also, if you've been viewing this and you're noticing tension in your shoulders, nausea, dizziness, any kind of panicky or just distressing kind of experiences, this is a weighty topic, and there is so much of this that overlaps with abusers' tactics. And so this can be, activating or triggering for some people. So be gentle with yourself, be kind, ask yourself, what do you need today? Do you need to pray? Do you need to laugh? Do you need to go out for a walk? Do you need to eat a nourishing meal? Or do you need to eat a few bars of chocolate? Whatever. Just be kind to yourself. And thank you so much for everybody that engaged. It was really wonderful, encouraging to me that so many people responded to this and have been engaging in the comments in the chat. And for you, Scott, I've interacted with you in the past, but this is the first time I've ever got to meet you. And so I'm super excited. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This was a great conversation, and thank you for pulling it together. And it's always good to be seen with Scott. It makes me look better. So, and I don't mean it brings me up to his level. Doesn't mean I look better than he does, because I certainly don't.
I feel the same way.
Yeah. Appreciate you, my friend.
Thank you.
both-
You too.
You both just reminded me of something from C.S. Lewis. I think it might be in the Four Loves, that people who are friends with each other are constantly thinking that they're the one that lucked out to be in the company of the other. And you guys are a great example of that. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you for everybody. This will at some point be available to view again on our YouTube channel. So look for that, and be blessed. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Boz.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.